Now a very good afternoon to Jim O'Hagan, who has an interesting piece of Belfast history to relate.
A few months ago, Walter, on a drizzling Sunday afternoon, I took a walk in the centre of Belfast and chanced to pass the Customs House near the Albert Clock. I walked around this majestic building and then crossed the road and viewed the west side where the present steps are. As I looked, my mind wandered back in imagination to about a century ago. Then, and at about the same time of day, many hundreds, sometimes thousands of people would be gathered in groups, big and small, listening to speakers giving forth on a variety of subjects. This was Belfast Speakers' Corner of the past, and politics, religion, and other issues of the day were raised by the speakers and often debated to the accompaniment of strong heckling. Barrack room lawyers were there in abundance. Quacks of all sorts and peddling merchants were there too, trading their wares. On a good day, 20 to 25 speakers surrounded the entire building, each trying to keep an audience, whilst on occasions might be seen a speaker addressing a blank space, but still going on, unperturbed. From my readings, the whole scene must have been very vibrant, the atmosphere heady and full of expectancy and excitement. One of the earliest of the religious demagogues at the steps was the Reverend Hugh Hanna, who was born near Dromara, County Down, in 1824. He was the Presbyterian minister of Berry Street Church from 1851, and then minister of St. Enoch's at Carlisle Circus from 1872. Indeed, a statue was erected to Roaring Hugh, as he was called, at Carlisle Circus, and remained there for many years until blown up by the IRA during the last 3 decades' troubles. Hannah's preaching on a Sunday afternoon sometimes led to violence and baton charging by the Royal Irish Constabulary in attempting to quell subsequent unrest in the crowd. Hannah, it is recorded, tended to blame his opponents for the trouble by stating that he was only preaching about his sincerely held religious views. He always took good care to disappear, it is said, very quickly once disorder had broken out. Later in life, he was a commissioner for national education. He died in 1892 and is buried in Balmoral Cemetery in the city. Another man of this era whose religious zeal sometimes got the better of his common sense was Frank Ballantyne. Commentators from the local newspapers at the time noted how he was an attacker of every sect but his own. Apparently it was his boast that he asked for no collection and preached because he could not help it, echoing Hannah in this to some degree. Above where he preached he had printed a banner with the words, "Remember Lot's wife," which puzzled many, and he always quoted from the Douay, or Catholic version of the Bible, which he referred to as a good home rule Bible. Some of his theories about religion were indeed quaint, and I think rather funny, Walter. For instance, he believed that barbers could not get into heaven, because, he said, Delilah had called one in to cut off Samson's hair. He was very strong in his dislike of free libraries, for there was only one book that was necessary to be read, the Bible. He hated ministers of religion of all denominations and harangued against amusements of any sort, ping-pong and all helleries, a word of his own invention. Many at the time saw Frank Ballantyne as a crank. In the heyday of the steps as a place where crowds gathered, political agitation was also a feature. At the time of the Second Home Rule Bill, a band of socialists led by William Walker, who later became famous in Belfast politics as a Labour parliamentary candidate, used the place to hold meetings. They aroused the opposition of Unionist religious leaders, and one, Arthur True in particular. He preached at the steps on a Sunday and drew large crowds to his Belfast Protestant Association, the movement he founded. Faction fighting developed between these two groups, often with the socialists having their meetings broken up. True was physically a small and somewhat disabled man who was born in 1866 in Barbados, the son of a soldier from Market Hill, County Armagh. His own story of how he became an orator at the steps is very interesting. It seems that one Sunday, when he was quite young, he heard Walker address a meeting there. Walker challenged anyone in the crowd to debate with him. True shouted up, "I will," and the crowd parted to allow him to the plinth. Apparently Walker then demurred, and a section of the crowd rushed at him with the intention of pushing him into the River Lagan, but the police rescued him. According to True, he himself turned up again on the next Sunday, intending to be a spectator, but the crowd spotted him and, seizing him, put him up on a box, and so his career as an orator began. Exaggerated or not, he had founded the Belfast Protestant Association within the next few years. He led protests against the centenary celebrations of the 1798 Rising in 1898, and in 1901 he interrupted a Catholic Corpus Christi procession in Belfast and was arrested and jailed for 12 months on a conspiracy to incite a riot charge. He was a stormy petrel and was also closely associated with Tom Sloan, who subsequently became the MP for South Belfast in 1902. They fell out, and some historians have accused Sloan of using True and the Belfast Protestant Association to further his own political ends, as he withdrew from his agitation at the Custom House steps, which he had attended regularly when he entered the Palace of Westminster. However, True continued his preaching after his release from jail for a good number of years, indeed many years. Some of your listeners may remember him. Told on one occasion that he would be shot at 4:30 p.m. on a certain Sunday afternoon at the steps, he bravely turned up, preached, and at 4:29 p.m. stopped. At that moment, a number of policemen rushed the steps to protect him. No shots were fired. Eventually he retired from the political arena and died in 1943, mourned by many and hated no doubt by an equal number. I knew his son many years later. He was a most tolerant man. Another figure of renown was Billy Hutton. He was a disciple of Frank Ballantyne and prided himself on being known as the terror of the low markets. The story is told, and it brings out for me that touch of eccentricity which is always interesting, that one day Hutton was preaching on the theme of insincerity when he suddenly stopped, flung open his coat and began tearing at his collar. Says he, "Sure, I'm as bad as the rest. I'm wearing a dickie and letting on it's a white shirt. Away with this hypocrisy." And he trampled the dickie under his feet. Incidentally, a dickie was a false shirt front. He was a stout, thick-set man with a close-cropped head, and it is said his language was not always fit for drawing-room conversation. Of course, Hutton's language was not always offensive, but occasionally very funny, and indeed many in the audience of such speakers could be entertained of a Sunday by such people. On a certain Sunday, Hutton entertained hugely his hearers with the following comments. I'm not a minister or a doctor with a coat buttoned so low that it is always kicking against my heels, and I couldn't tell you the name of every queer disease that's going about. But can you tell me why, when there was a severe load of the cowl going about, the doctors had to brutalise a Greek name instead of an English one for it, and called it influenza? Sure, if you take a pound of oatmeal and boil it and put in some brown sugar and sup it and put on a bit of extra flannel, when you go out you'll get rid of any cowl you had. That Walter was a flavour of the man in his more temperate moments. Another speaker at the steps, and some of your listeners may remember him, though his name escapes me, but he was supposedly Sandy Herd. He was a bit of a character too. His characteristic was to emphasise every point he made, like a boxer feinting for an opening. He used a bottle holder to put his hat on, and had a number of second-hand books spread out in front of him on a sheet of brown paper. He referred from time to time for a telling quotation from these. Like many of the speakers at the steps, he showed little false modesty. On one occasion, referring to his reputation for being a big head, he admitted to this trait, but said that at least his head had something in it, and not like some other people's heads, which were as boost as an empty pot. F. Frankfurt Moore, writing in the late 20s of his recollections of 50 years earlier, said that of all the orators of his youth, the one who impressed him most at the steps was a man with, to me, a most resounding name, the Reverend Henry Grattan Guinness. Moore praised his sincerity greatly as a man of religion who was most anxious not to score cheap political points off his opponents, but rather his sheer grandiloquence as a preacher attracted thousands to hear him. Another preacher whom Moore remembers was Buck Mateer, who wore green glasses and had an enormous and determined stride to his walk. Other people remembered the Reverends Crawford Johnston and C.M. Kerr. Many reminiscences were recalled in the press in the closing months of 1928, for it was then that the roadway around the Customs House was altered to give more quay space in Donegal Quay and widened adjacent carriageways. The scheme cost $7,000 and was shared equally between the Belfast Corporation and the Belfast Harbour Commissioners. It involved the taking away of the plinth of 3 or 4 steps which surrounded the building. It was on this plinth that the speaker stood, and many commentators predicted the demise of the area as a speaker's forum when this was accomplished. And to some extent they were correct, although activity continued as before on Sundays, though on a rather reduced scale. For instance, the large rallies concerned with the outdoor relief strike of the 1930s had the steps as their focal point, and activity continued right into the 40s and 50s. Walter, a few words about the building itself. It was designed by Charles Lanyon in 1857 and is described by Sir Charles Brett as Belfast's finest public building, and to quote him, the peak of Lanyon's achievement in the Italian style after Palladio. The building is superb, with a magnificent seaward facade with its carving on the pediment. This was carried out by Thomas Fitzpatrick and is made up of the large figures of Britannia, flanked by Lion and Unicorn and Neptune and Mercury. Into the work are introduced capstans, barrels and rope ends. It replaced an earlier ramshackle building. In fact, the first customs house was built in the High Street area in the early 18th century. Lanyon was born in Sussex in 1813 and was in his time county surveyor for County Antrim, where he built in 1836 the Glendon Road Viaduct and also the Fossers Road between Ballymena and Ballymoney. In Belfast in 1839-40, he designed the Palm House in the Botanic Gardens, and in 1846 Crumlin Road Jail. Other buildings designed by him included Queen's College, now University, and Sinclair Seamen's Church. He became MP for Belfast in 1867 and was knighted in 1868. He died in 1889 after an illustrious career and is buried in Knockbreda Cemetery. To get back to the scene at the steps, Walter, and relate about other characters, one correspondent in the Belfast newsletter in the 1940s told about merchants trying to sell their products. One man, in attempting to impress his listeners as to the effect his elixir in a bottle would have on them, said, "If you take a course of this and you're 60, you'll feel like 40. If you're 40, you'll feel like 20. If you're 20," and by this time the crowd were breathless, he stopped. The newsletter correspondent commented wryly, this tale of rejuvenation apparently had its limits. A man of my acquaintance, now dead, recalled for me how in the 50s he used to watch the goings-on. A peddler salesman, a popular coloured man he remembered well. This man's sales tack was to hold up whatever he was selling and then dash through the crowd with it, saying, "I am selling, I am selling." He always returned empty-handed. He kept this up the whole time, and by the end of the afternoon had cleared his stock. He must have been pretty exhausted, though. My friend's overall comment on the Seedon with regard to the speakers was, they could prove anything, even that Euclid, the master of mathematics, had seen things from the wrong angle. William Bulfin, in his Rambles in Erin, Volume 1, had some caustic remarks to make about the speakers he observed at the steps. He called it the storm centre of ranting aggressiveness, where the Pope is dethroned, scalped, roasted, and consigned to eternal perdition every Sunday afternoon. Strong words indeed. Bulfin goes on in a quieter manner to describe the Salvation Army people and their activities, and speaks generously of generals, colonels, majors and majoresses parading and playing concertinas, telling how they were saved, and speaking in a most intimate way about God and the devil. It's interesting, Walter, to note that the Salvation Army Hostel, which is still in the area today, is listed in the 1908 street directory as on virtually the same site. Nowadays the tumult at the steps is no more, and the building itself houses customs and excise offices, some civil service departments, and offices connected with maritime shipping. Indeed, for nearly as far back, perhaps 40 years as I can remember, the scene on Sunday in this area has become very quiet, save for the noise of passing traffic. I seem to recall in the late 50s a small crowd of not more than 20 or 30 at the steps on a Sunday, listening passively to perhaps one or two isolated speakers. The phrase, "I'll see you on Sunday at the steps," would no longer have any meaning for people today. Like Smithfield Market of yesteryear, the former scene at the Custom House is now a relic of a bygone age. In many ways, it's just as well, though in their time the steps as a place where speakers could rant and rave served its purpose, I suppose, as a safety valve for pent-up emotions. We do miss, though, the colour of the scene.
And Jim O'Hagan will have another episode from Belfast Past for us shortly.
Oh, Mr. Crosby,
Yeah.
oh, Mr. Crosby, Ask me, son.
All the orchestras are swinging it today.
Biggest kind of gates.
And I wanted to find out what the noise is all about.
Yeah.
Do you really think that swing is here to stay?
Well, now, I'm glad you asked me. Mr. Mercer.
Yeah?
Oh, Mr. Mercer.
I'm listening.
Swing is really much too ancient to condemn.
Why, you don't say.
In the jungles they would play in that same abandoned way.
On the level, Mr. Crosby.
Oh, on the downbeat, Mr. M.
Oh, Mr. Crosby. Now, Mr. Crosby,
So happy to oblige.
I've been reading in the latest magazine
Yes.
that a jiving jitterbug blows his top and cuts a rug. Will you tell me what that language really means?
Oh, Mr. Mercer.
Yes, yes.
Oh, Mr. Mercer.
Tell me.
As a student of the slang, they use pro tem.
Pro what?
That just means a solid gait. Cuts a murderistic plate.
That's amazing, Mr. Crosby.
That's elementary, Mr. M.
Oh, Mr. Crosby. Dear Dr. Crosby, is it true that swing's another name for jazz? And the first place it was played was a New Orleans parade, and the Southern Negro gave it all it had.
Oh, Mr. Mercer, Mr. Mercer. I believe that its foundation came from them.
Are you positive?
Yes, they just slowed the tempo down. And then they really went to town.
Allegretto, Mr. Crosby.
Alligators, Mr. M. Oh, Mr. Mercer.
Yes?
Oh, Mr. Mercer. Well, I trust that I have made the matter clear.
It's really too clear.
So when someone plays a thing, you're going to understand its swing and appreciate the rhythm that you hear.
Oh, Mr. Crosby.
Oh, hear me talk
No,
to you.
Mr. Crosby. I'm afraid that type of rhythm's not for me. I prefer my music played a la Schubert serenade.
Sort of retardo, Mr. Mercer.
Sort of Lombardo, Mr. C.
Well, Hugh McKeown is back.